and it's really a pleasure to be here with you. I've enjoyed the panels that I've been able to sit in on and have learned a great deal about President Carter's work in areas that I was not necessarily familiar with, so that is great. I'm particularly appreciative because this has allowed me to review some of the efforts that I was involved in with President Carter back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I should say at the outset that although I'll be referring to President Carter, Mrs. Carter was always part of these delegations and played in her own way a very important role in these efforts. This is a topic that I think in some ways personified President Carter's post-presidency activities. In some ways it became something that people around the globe were familiar with from just seeing him in different countries with his observer jacket on or whatever he was wearing at the time. But it really made a tremendous impression on a lot of people. As Maria said, I worked with President Carter in Panama in 1989, Nicaragua in 1990, Haiti in 1991, Zambia in 1990, also in 1991, and then in Palestine in 2006. And because of the recent events there, I'm going to refer specifically near the end of my presentation to the activities there and some of the implications for the future. I also should say that I'm here, as Maria said, as an independent consultant, expert, someone who's studied this field for many years, but I'm not speaking here on behalf of the Carter Center. Let me start by affirming that President Carter, without doubt, transformed election observation from an activity that involved the passive assessment of a process, of an electoral process, to a series of proactive engagements before, during, and after elections. In addition, he established what I call the model of poll watching and peacemaking that fits directly into the theme of this conference and the mandate, as I understand it, of George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Reconciliation. Finally, President Carter, through the work of his team at the Carter Center, helped institutionalize and standardize the role of election observers through promulgation of the 2005 Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation, which has now been adopted by more than 50 intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. At the outset, let me highlight the following specific contributions that I associate with President Carter's involvement, and then I'll describe some of the specific country examples that we worked together on. First, he proactively advocated for changes in a country's election system during the pre-electoral period so as to enhance the quality of the electoral process. He sought express commitments from parties and candidates to accept publicly the results of credible elections. And yes, I will reflect upon, in my closing remarks, how this has now become a problem in the United States and what President Carter has sought to do about that too. He emphasized the necessity of observers having access to reliable data that can confirm or rebut the results announced by the body responsible for administering the elections. He spoke out forcibly when he believed that election results did not reflect the choices expressed by the electorate. He also recognized the importance of observers staying engaged after the elections to promote electoral reforms and respect for human rights. Finally, he occasionally went beyond his mandate to achieve what he thought was necessary to promote peace and reconciliation, or even to ensure that an individual voter was given the opportunity to cast his or her ballot. To set the stage for President Carter's engagement, I'll provide a very brief overview of the state of international observation circa the 1980s. I will then describe President Carter's initial foray into the field in Panama in 1989, highlight specific aspects of the 3 observer missions where I worked with President Carter in the 1990s, and then focus on the Palestinian election in 2006. At the outset of the 1990s, international election observation was often derided as mere electoral tourism. Observers would arrive in a country a few days before an election, visit polling sites on election day, and then issue usually a congratulatory statement reflecting their limited election day observations. The potential peacemaking role of international observation was highlighted by the 1980 elections in what is now the nation of Zimbabwe. As part of the Lancaster House Accords, which was designed to facilitate a transition to majority rule after 15 years of bloody conflict, the Commonwealth of Nations agreed to organize an international observer mission. The team included 11 lead observers and 52 assistants. Members of the mission spent more than 3 months in what was then called Southern Rhodesia. Following the elections, the delegation issued a detailed report on their findings and a detailed list of recommendations for the incoming government. More important, their efforts were seen as contributing to a peaceful transition of power from a white-led minority government to a government where all those living in the country could participate in the elections. My personal involvement in this field began in 1983, when I was recruited by the now defunct International Human Rights Law Group to prepare a handbook for use by international observers. The impetus for this effort were a series of elections in Latin America, which were conducted either amidst conflict or by an authoritarian regime. To provide standards for assessing such processes, the law group received a grant from the U.S. Agency for International Development. The handbook was published in 1984 and became the basis for efforts by the law group and then the National Democratic Institute, where I served as a consultant in countries around the globe, including Zimbabwe, Philippines, South Korea, Chile, and Pakistan. President Carter, meanwhile, had established the Carter Center in Atlanta, which we've talked about much during this conference, and was looking for a vehicle to translate his commitment to human rights into practical action. With this goal in mind, he formed the Council of Freely Elected Former Heads of Government in 1986 to reinforce democracy in the Americas. The 1989 elections in Panama offered President Carter and the Council their initial opportunity to participate in an international election observer mission. NDI and its Republican counterpart had received a grant from USAID to sponsor an international observer mission for the election that was scheduled in May of that year. NDI invited President Carter to lead the delegation, while the Republican Institute invited former President Ford, with whom Carter had established a collaborative post-presidency relationship. President Carter, of course, had been intimately involved in ensuring that the Panama Canal Treaty was approved by the U.S. Senate in 1977. However, Carter's Panamanian partner in this effort, Omar Torrijos, was killed in a 1981 plane crash and ultimately was replaced by Manuel Noriega. Noriega was credibly accused of being responsible for human rights abuses in the country and for facilitating the drug trade. The 1989 elections, therefore, were seen as an opportunity for the Panamanians to establish or reestablish democracy in their country. As a project manager for NDI, I was tasked with briefing President Carter on his arrival in Panama days prior to the election. I described our assessment of the situation and the plans that we had put in place to affirm the credibility of the vote count. He then grilled me about the mechanics of the election administration and our delegation's plans for the observation. I was surprised and indeed intimidated by the level of understanding he exhibited and the precision of his questions. Election day in Panama was relatively peaceful and the turnout was larger than expected. A colleague and I spent the night in a private home where fax machines, this is way before cell phones and the like, were set up to receive the unofficial results being collected by representatives of a local NGO. This rudimentary but effective parallel vote tabulation, colloquially known as a PVT, established that the opposition had won an overwhelming victory. My colleague briefed President Carter the following morning regarding the PVT results. However, when President Carter visited the convention center where the official results were being collected, he was surprised at how few results had been posted. He returned to the convention center a few hours later, and nothing had changed. After a heated exchange with election officials, he concluded that the regime was intent on manipulating the results in order to remain in power. Hence, he decided then and there to convene a press conference where he denounced the process. I was initially concerned about President Carter acting unilaterally without consulting other members of the delegation. But his stature as a former president and his long history of involvement with Panama made his heartfelt denunciation all the more impactful. His statement influenced the international response and led to a condemnatory resolution by the Organization of American States, which highlighted the outrageous abuses committed against the opposition. But these actions did not result in the election winners assuming office. Indeed, despite the internal and external pressures that were placed on Noriega, U.S. troops were ultimately required to remove him from office in December 1989. He was brought to the United States in January 1990, where he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. President Carter was excited by the critical role that he played in Panama and decided to make international election observation a major component of the Carter Center's work. In 1990, President Carter led an independent team of observers which worked in conjunction with the United Nations and the Organization of American States, where I was serving as a consultant, to monitor the elections. President Carter engaged early in the electoral process with the leading actors, establishing his credibility as an honest broker. This early engagement proved critical on election night, when he and his UN and OAS counterparts met with Daniel Ortega, who was running for a third term as president, and convinced him to accept the results that had again been projected by a PVT and that showed that he had been defeated by the opposition candidate, Violeta Chamorro. Ortega issued a statement conceding the election and congratulating Chamorro, again much under the influence of President Carter and his colleagues. 10 months later, President Carter, operating under the auspices of the Council of freely elected former heads of government, teamed up with NDI to observe the elections in Haiti. Previous elections in the country had ended in violence or had been boycotted by most of the political parties. The new entrant in the 1990 elections was Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a Catholic priest who was incredibly popular among the masses of poor Haitians. The night before the election, Carter and other leaders of the delegation met with Aristide and asked him, as he had done with other candidates, to commit to accepting the results regardless of who was the victor. Aristide was initially reluctant to make such a statement, claiming that he was confident that he would win. But after former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Andrew Young, begged him, literally getting down on his hands and knees, he agreed. In the event, Aristide won overwhelmingly with 67% of the vote and assumed office, although he was overthrown in a coup 9 months later and was only restored to office in 1994 with the strong backing of the United States. In 1991, NDI and the Carter Center teamed up to observe elections, the first multi-party elections in Zambia since shortly after independence. The incumbent, Kenneth Kaunda, had served as president since 1964 and was being challenged by Frederick Chiluba, who was the Secretary General of Zambia's powerful trade unions. A month prior to the elections, President Carter led a pre-election mission to Zambia, where he met with the major actors and raised serious reservations about the state of electoral preparations. The ruling party responded with a point-by-point rebuttal of President Carter's expressed concerns. President Carter then dispatched two well-respected individuals who had worked with the Carter Center and NDI to reassure the ruling party that as international observers, we understood the limits of our role, while at the same time continuing to press for changes in the electoral process. One anecdote from Election Day, which I observed with President Carter, illustrates his concern for the rights of individual voters and his willingness, at times, to actively intervene with election officials. Visiting a polling site in Lusaka, we encountered a woman on crutches who was told that she was at the wrong polling site and directed her to a polling site some distance away. President Carter invited her to travel in our van to the polling site to which he had been directed. When the polling official there told the woman that she, again, was at the wrong polling site, President Carter personally interceded with them to insist that they provide the woman with a ballot so she could cast her vote. This was not exactly per the established etiquette for international observers, but I was convinced his efforts had resulted in a just outcome. President Carter's main contribution in Zambia, as in Nicaragua the previous year, was to convince Kaunda to concede defeat. He encouraged Kaunda to play the role of an African elder, offering as an example his own experience as a former president. Chiluba's inauguration took place 3 days later, and it took place in the presence of President Carter. I will note here that President Carter's proactive approach to election observation has now become prevalent in Africa. Other former heads of African countries have frequently led delegations and played the role of mediators in seeking to avoid conflict and in resolving electoral disputes. Their international observers are not always successful, and there have been several recent examples where their advice was not heeded, but the model promoted by President Carter has now become the established norm in Africa. I entered government service in 1993 as a political appointee under President Clinton, and thus did not have the opportunity to work again with President Carter until January 2006. Having served for 5 years as the U.S. Mission Director for the West Bank and Gaza, I was invited to join a delegation organized by NDI to observe the National Assembly elections in Palestine. Once again, NDI partnered with President Carter and the Carter Center in conducting the observer mission. To be honest, I had not initially planned on discussing this experience in detail, but given developments of the past day, I decided to review some of the materials from that time, including the NDI report, and reread sections of President Carter's book, which has been referenced at earlier panels, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, which was published at the end of 1996. As a reference point for those not familiar with Palestinian political history, Hamas won 75 of the 132 National Assembly seats that were contested, while Fatah, which had long been the dominant player in Palestinian politics, won only 45 seats. The results were a surprise to most analysts, who expected Hamas to do well, but certainly not to win a majority. NDI's posture regarding Hamas was to avoid meeting with their representatives since, to quote NDI's final report, Hamas's participation, while simultaneously advocating violence, is not consistent with a fundamental principle of democratic elections. More broadly, the report's executive summary states, and I quote, "The January 25 elections represented a unique challenge in that they brought to power a group that advocates the use of violence as a means of achieving a political end, refuses to give up arms, and is committed to the destruction of a UN member state. For his part, President Carter, in his book, relates that he pledged not to meet with Hamas until after the elections. However, after the elections, he's decided it was time for him to consult with Hamas. He reports that he questioned his Hamas interlocutor, who had been elected as a representative of the National Assembly, as to whether Hamas would renounce violence and recognize Israel. He was told that Hamas was committed to maintaining a ceasefire, potentially for several years, and that its immediate priorities were to form a government, to maintain order, and to deal with the financial crisis. While Carter hoped that Hamas would change its rejectionist attitude, he also implicitly criticized the U.S. policy of refusing to engage with Hamas until it formally and publicly renounced violence and recognized Israel. Palestinians have not held national elections since 2006, and like in other settings, the U.S. government has not pressed for such elections. In large measure, this has been due to a fear that Hamas might again win an electoral victory, which in turn would complicate efforts to revive a long stalemated peace process. Fast forward ahead 16 years. I was recruited to lead a 3-person Carter Center expert mission to assess the March 2022 municipal elections in the West Bank. In our report, we noted, quote, that virtually all Palestinian stakeholders agreed that reconciliation between the major parties, Fatah and Hamas, is essential for genuine democratic development. However, we criticized Hamas for refusing to permit the municipal elections to take place in Gaza. Several weeks ago, Hamas seemed to be moving towards holding municipal elections. However, in light of the recent developments, we have to ask whether this formed part of their plan to deceive the Israelis or reflected a genuine interest of at least some Hamas political leaders. I don't have the answer, and I think historians and analysts will be debating this for a long time. Regardless, the horrors of October 7th seemingly have ended debate regarding Hamas's viability as a political actor that would be acceptable to Israel, the United States, or other democratic countries. I want to conclude my presentation by highlighting the fact that earlier than many, President Carter recognized that electoral reforms were not only required as part of his efforts to promote peace and human rights abroad, but also in this country. In 2005, he co-chaired with former Secretary of State Jim Baker a bipartisan commission that examined outstanding election reform issues. The commission issued a final report, which was titled Building Confidence in U.S. Elections, and which made a series of quite far-reaching recommendations. Following the bitterly fought presidential election in 2020, many of the issues that Carter Baker addressed in 2005 were once again back in the news. In response, the Carter Center and the Baker Institute organized a series of webinars to review the status of the recommendations. More generally, the Carter Center established a U.S. election project to apply some of the techniques developed monitoring elections overseas to the United States, including monitoring specific aspects of elections in specific states. Let me quote by quoting from President Carter's op-ed published in the New York Times on January 5, 2022. Our great nation now teeters on the brink of a widening abyss. Without immediate actions, we are at the genuine risk of civil conflict and losing our precious democracy. Americans must set aside differences and work together before it is too late. Thank you for allowing me to offer these reflections about a great American and his contributions to the cause of democracy around the globe.
Jeff Helsing here at the Carter School. The question I wanted to ask was, you ended sort of talking about the election, the Fatah-Hamas election in the West Bank, and it made me wonder the degree to which that election, and I'm also thinking of the Algerian election, but I'm less knowledgeable about that one, that those elections undermined the credibility of election monitoring, because in the end, the results were actually not accepted. And so you talked about Carter's ability to get Kenneth Kaunda and Daniel Ortega to, in effect, accept the results of the elections. But in the cases you end up with, in fact, this global community actually rejects what were essentially fair elections. So to what degree in your work does that create real problems in the broader work of election monitoring?
Great question, and one that is being, it has been and continues to be debated. You mentioned the Algeria elections. I think it was 1991 when, again, I don't know what to call it, I forgot, Brotherhood-oriented party won the elections, and that they were not recognized and ultimately not accepted within Algeria. What I was trying to get at is that there was a dialectic that play even before the elections and certainly after the elections between those who basically thought that Hamas should not be allowed to participate in these elections until they renounced violence, and others who thought that getting them inside the political process potentially might moderate their views and perspectives. No one at the time believed that they would win the elections. And so the assumption was that the incumbent Fatah party would win, there'd be a significant representation of Hamas, and then, we would see by their actions whether they were willing to participate in a political process. It was only after the elections, and it was evident that Hamas had won, that we had to deal with the reality of this, and there were competing views as to how we should do so. Some argued for, trying to engage them, not requiring them to take steps that we knew would be impossible for them, but to make or send signals that would indicate that they would be a peaceful actor in this process. And others, including the United States government at the time, simply said no, until they meet these three conditions, we are not going to engage them at all. And that debate, I think, continued up until 10 days ago, when, I think today perspectives have changed.
So many complexities. Well, thank you for joining us today. It's been
My pleasure.
And I hope you can stay with questions for the audience after.